Hey guys, tonight we're time traveling to an era where beauty was dangerous, divine, and honestly a little weird. Imagine stepping into a smoky candlelit room of a medieval manor. You catch a glimpse of yourself in a polished bronze mirror. Your forehead isn't nearly high enough. Your skin? Tragically tan from the walk here. And your teeth? Let's just say the peasants had better odds. You're surrounded by tapestries, the scent of rosewater and mildew in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a lute is being played terribly. Welcome to a world where beauty wasn't just a personal statement. It was your social resume. Every feature, every gesture, every curl of hair told a story about your class, your virtue, and your chances of surviving the winter. And honestly, you probably won't survive this standard of beauty. But hey, at least you'll look ethereal while trying. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing the sleepy global squad check in. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the cobbled courtyard and into the great hall of a noble household. It's drafty, but the fire's lit. A young woman in a layered linen gown lowers her eyes as she passes you. Modesty was attractive after all, and you spot a small hand mirror peeking out from her sash. Mirrors were rare, expensive, and slightly scandalous. To care that much about your appearance? Well, it bordered on vanity, but let's be real, everyone cared. Especially if they had the means to do something about it. In medieval Europe, beauty was about more than aesthetics. It was a language. Your appearance told people whether you were rich or poor, virtuous or sinful, blessed or cursed. You couldn't just look good, you had to look correct. The rules weren't written anywhere, but everyone knew them, and they were brutal. First off, your station in life dictated what kind of beauty you were expected to pursue. A noblewoman's beauty was all about fragility. Thin, pale, and untouchable, like she'd never worked a day in her life because she probably hadn't. A peasant girl, on the other hand, was expected to be hardy, healthy, and clean enough. Not too clean. Bathing too often made people suspicious. Are you hiding something, like the pox? Now step into the shoes of a young noblewoman. Your family wants to marry you off, and your mother is teaching you the art of appearing valuable. That starts with the face. You're told your forehead is too low. Don't take it personally and hand it a pair of tweezers. You pluck your hairline upward, strand by strand, until you look suitably wise. A high brow means intelligence and nobility. Also, you cry. A lot. But that's good too. Watery eyes are in. One mainstream historical fact? That would be how pale skin was universally desired in medieval European courts. It was proof you didn't work in the fields. Tanned skin. Instant class downgrade. To stay pale, women wore large hats, stayed indoors, and even powdered their faces with dangerous substances like lead and mercury. Yes, mercury. This is where that "you probably won't survive this" part kicks in. And the fringe tidbit? Some women applied a paste made from crushed lily petals and pigeon droppings to their skin. Supposedly it made the face glow. Pigeons, the original skincare influencers, but not everyone agreed on the definition of beauty. Historians still argue whether medieval standards were as rigid as they seem in illuminated manuscripts. After all, peasant poetry and folk songs praised apple cheeks, sun-kissed skin, and women who could swing an axe. Context mattered. You walk past a tapestry showing the goddess Venus. She's naked, of course, but posed modestly with long flowing hair, and the ever-important high forehead. She's the ideal, but also an unattainable one. Real women worked with what they had, using whatever odd remedies or rituals they could afford. And believe me, some of them were deeply creative. Across the room, two noblewomen whisper behind their fans. One is wearing a veil to hide a breakout, The other has rubbed crushed rosemary into her cheeks for a rosy tint. Natural blush was the goal, but of course they weren't above faking it. If caught, they'd swear it was just the cold wind. Everybody lied about makeup. Even monks sometimes dabbled, especially when performing religious dramas. Nothing says holiness like a touch of rouge. And that brings us to the contradiction at the heart of medieval beauty. Everyone pursued it, but no one was supposed to admit to it. Vanity was a sin. And yet, saints were often described as physically radiant. So radiant that people wept at the sight of them. Holiness and beauty were sometimes seen as one and the same, but only if the beauty seemed effortless, divinely bestowed. Try too hard, and suddenly you're a Jezebel. That line between piety and pride was razor thin. Walk it well, and you were admired. Cross it, and you might find yourself accused of sorcery. Or worse, unladylike behavior. As you lean closer to a mirror on the wall, barely reflective but good enough, you wonder, what would they think of you? Your face, your clothes, your hands that maybe aren't soft enough. Would you be seen as beautiful, exotic, sinful? You reach up to touch your hair. Still too flat. A young girl with a basket of herbs walks past and drops a sprig of lavender into your hand. She whispers something about boiling it with goat milk for shine. Sounds like a potion. Might be a shampoo. Might be both. And with that, the evening presses onward. The fire crackles low. Shadows stretch across the stone walls. Someone starts to sing a quiet tune about a maiden so fair birds refuse to fly above her, fearing their own ugliness in comparison. You smile. You know the feeling. You've entered a world where beauty is a battlefield, but one fought with herbs, silence, and hopeful glances. You slip quietly through the stone hallway of the manor, torchlight flickering against frescoed walls until you find yourself in a small room smelling faintly of beeswax and something sharp. Maybe vinegar, maybe regret. A girl is seated before a low mirror. She's plucking her hairline. Carefully, methodically. Her maid hovers nearby holding a bowl of warm water, ready to soothe the inflamed skin once the ritual is complete. This is not a private moment. This is transformation in motion. The high forehead isn't just fashionable, it's symbolic. It screams, I have education, I have refinement, I've read books I'm not even allowed to own. The higher your brow, the closer to God and to courtly ideals. So yes, they plucked their foreheads, often well into their hairline. Some even rubbed walnut oil to thin the roots and make plucking easier. It's the medieval equivalent of laser hair removal, with 0 lasers and a lot more praying. You take a seat by the fire, rubbing your temples and marveling at the pain women endured for a fashion trend that now screams 5-head in modern memes. But in this world, it's the equivalent of contouring with a scalpel. Beyond the hairline, there's the skin. A noblewoman's skin was expected to be pale, blemish-free, and slightly translucent, like she glowed from within. Not from joy, mind you, but probably from the toxic concoctions applied nightly. Want one? Here's a recipe. Mix vinegar, crushed white lead, and egg whites. Add a dash of powdered bone or chalk. Apply before bed. Try not to die, and freckles? Oh no, freckles were not in fashion. They were called God's crumbs, and depending on the region, they could be seen as divine or demonic. In most of Europe, though, they were marks to be bleached, hidden, or scrubbed away. You'd likely rub your face with lemon juice, sour milk, or, wait for it, ground up cuttlefish bone. The exfoliation was probably fantastic. The smell, not so much. One mainstream fact worth knowing: the obsession with skin purity had real consequences. Noble women often stayed indoors entirely, sometimes for weeks, just to keep their complexions fair. Sunlight was the enemy. Parasols were a privilege. And don't even think about working outdoors. That was peasant behavior. Meanwhile, in quieter corners of the countryside, women had their own traditions. They used mashed strawberries to brighten their cheeks, rubbed dock leaves on mosquito bites, and swore by rainwater rinses. This wasn't vanity, it was survival. Looking clean meant looking trustworthy. Looking trustworthy meant safer trades, better marriage offers, and less suspicion from the church. A quirky tidbit? In some courts, women painted blue veins onto their temples with crushed lapis or woad to make themselves look more ethereal. The logic? If you could see your veins, your skin was thin and aristocratic. If your skin was thick, you probably worked for a living, and manual labor. Now imagine you're a man stepping into this room of rituals. You try to make yourself useful. You pick up a small brush lying next to the hearth and ask what it's for. The girl tells you it's for brushing the eyebrows upward before trimming them nearly out of existence. Surprise! No brows is in. Soft, rounded faces with childlike features were considered the height of virtue. There's even a fringe case of women shaving their eyebrows entirely and redrawing them with coal or soot in tiny, barely there arcs, like the ghost of a brow. The style made them look permanently surprised, which honestly feels accurate for a life spent dodging plague, politics, and patriarchal nonsense. Historians still argue whether these grooming rituals were widespread or limited to wealthy women in major cities. Some evidence suggests peasant women in France and England adopted simplified versions, rinsing with whey, using mud as facial masks, even burning dried herbs to steam the face. You reach toward a silver tray. A delicate vial sits at its center, the glass cloudy, the contents slightly pink. It's labeled rose vinegar. When dabbed on the cheeks, it gives the skin a flushed, innocent glow. When applied to a wound, it stings like betrayal. Multi-purpose beauty. We love to see it. The girl looks at you again, this time without modesty. Her forehead is bare, high, and red from plucking. Her skin is powdered. Her lips have been subtly tinted with crushed berries, just enough to look kissed by God, not kissed by the stable boy. And now she adds a final touch, a dab of honey along the cheekbones. The shine reflects the firelight, making her glow, literally. And also bees might chase her, but that's a risk she's willing to take. You hear voices from the hallway. The lady of the manor is coming, and she'll be evaluating beauty like it's court currency. The young woman beside you straightens up, adjusts her wimple, and whispers a prayer. Not to be beautiful, but to look like she isn't trying. Isn't that the paradox? To achieve the appearance of effortlessness, you had to try harder than anyone else. And suddenly a question hits you. Would you have survived this standard? Could you have kept your hairline receding by choice? Bathed in vinegar? Or faked a fever just to look fashionable? Probably not. But then again, in this world, the pain is temporary. The perception? Eternal. The door opens. The lady enters. She glances at you briefly, your forehead too low, your freckles unhidden, your brows tragically expressive, and then looks away. You've failed the test. But the girl beside you? She glows with a kind of quiet pride, and for now that's enough. You follow the rustle of linen and whispers through a narrow staircase, spiraling toward the upper chambers of the manor. As you ascend, the scent changes. Gone is the vinegar and soot of the grooming rooms. Up here, it's all lavender sachets, dried rose petals, and something faintly smoky, like singed herbs or old secrets. You're entering the realm of hair, its care, its code, and its near mystical power. In medieval society, hair wasn't just hair. It was a halo, a symbol, a loaded metaphor tangled with everything from virginity to vanity. And yes, your hairstyle could make or break your marriage prospects. You peek inside a sunlit chamber where two maids are gently combing through a noblewoman's long blonde hair. It spills across her back like spun gold, probably enhanced with crushed chamomile and patience. In the corner, a small pot simmers over a brazier. Rosemary and sage steep in water, releasing their earthy steam into the air. Her rinse is brewing. Hair care was serious business, especially if you were noble and female. A mainstream historical fact? Noble women rarely cut their hair after a certain age. Long hair symbolized health, fertility, and the good graces of God. The longer the better, ideally trailing behind like a bridal train, though always kept modestly hidden in public, wrapped in veils or tucked under elaborate headdresses. And those headdresses were architectural. Hennins, those tall, pointy cone hats, were not just fashion statements. They elevated the wearer both literally and socially. The taller the hennin, the higher your status. There's even a satirical French poem from the 15th century complaining that some women's hennins scraped the sky. Jealousy is timeless. Now, not all women had golden Rapunzel locks, obviously, but that's where art and poetry came in to fill the gap. Descriptions of sun-touched tresses and silken braids were so overused in courtly love poems, they became cliches even back then. You can almost hear the medieval bard sighing, "Ugh, another flaxen-haired maiden?" But let's talk reality. Not everyone could afford luxury oils or saffron-infused rinse water. Peasant women used nettles, beer, and egg yolks to wash and soften their hair. Did it smell great? Debatable. Did it work? Apparently, yes. Beer and egg protein were early conditioners. Your local alewife was also, incidentally, a hair influencer. A quirky tidbit? In Germany, brides sometimes braided ribbons, coins, or even tiny bells into their hair before the wedding ceremony. The goal was to attract good fortune, and maybe show off how good they were at braiding. Which, frankly, is a skill worth showing off. Historians still argue whether elaborate hair rituals were common outside noble households. Some suggest that urban merchant-class women in cities like Bruges or Florence invested heavily in hair care as a way to level up socially. The line between grooming and ambition was razor thin. Now you step closer to the fire and notice the noblewoman's maid unrolling something wrapped in linen. It's a wig. Not the powdered kind you'd find centuries later, but a netted, curled mass of human or horsehair sewn into a cap. For days when your hair just wouldn't cooperate, or when illness had thinned it. Some even wore wigs under their veils to fake the volume. You know, for those "I woke up like this" moments, hair color mattered too. Blondes were idealized thanks to religious art. Mary was often depicted fair-haired. But in Italy, Venetian women were praised for their fiery red locks, which they often enhanced with saffron and sunlight. They'd sit on rooftop terraces in bathing bonnets that exposed only their hair, which they soaked in strange, sunny potions. Think of it as medieval balayage with extra heat stroke. You glance toward a window, and sure enough, a young girl is perched on the roof nearby. Her hair glistens, wrapped around wooden rollers as she holds a mirror to the sun. She looks directly at you and mouths something in Latin. You don't catch it, but it's probably either "beauty is pain" or "I'm cooking my scalp." In the monastery, things were different. Nuns often shaved their heads upon taking vows, both as a symbol of devotion and a way to strip away vanity. It wasn't always required, but many took the path willingly. Baldness here was sacred. And then there were men. Yes, they had hair standards too. You head down to the training grounds, where a group of squires are sparring with wooden swords. One young man, clearly more into mirrors than melee, has his long hair tied back with a ribbon and a comb tucked into his belt. He sees you staring and shrugs. The Lady Anne prefers it braided. Male beauty meant different things depending on your role. Knights favored thick hair and beards, symbols of strength, virility, and divine favor. But clerics were often tonsured, their hair cropped into a monk's circle to show humility. The hairstyle screamed, "I've given up earthly vanity," while still being oddly high maintenance. And then there's a whole separate aesthetic: courtly, poetic, and slightly fragile. In the French and English courts, young noblemen sometimes wore soft curls, used rose water, and even lightened their hair with lemon juice to achieve a golden halo effect. Because nothing says chivalrous like smelling like a salad. You pass by a small basin where a boy is rinsing his sister's hair with cold river water. She squeals at the chill, laughing as he flicks droplets at her nose. It's a simple moment. No henna, no incense, no crushed sapphires, just care. And honestly, it's kind of beautiful. In a world where beauty was often artifice, this moment feels rare. Still, the expectations were real. A tangled braid could mean you were lazy. Oily hair? Poor hygiene, or worse, loose morals. A well-kept head of hair was a passport, a social currency, and sometimes an escape. You look again at the noblewoman upstairs. Her hair now braided and coiled into a shape resembling a small birdcage, hidden beneath gauze and pearls. She walks slowly, back straight, gaze lowered. She's perfect. She's also probably itching like mad from whatever beeswax they used to set those curls. And as she disappears down the hallway, one thought lingers. You'll never look at your conditioner the same way again. The morning light filters through slitted windows, slanting across a long stone corridor like blades of gold. You follow them until you find yourself in a small chamber filled with bowls, cloths, and several mortars and pestles that have seen some things. A woman, middle-aged and serious, is stirring something in a shallow dish. It glistens faintly, white, thick, and a little bit ominous. She gestures to the stool beside her without looking up. Sit if you want to learn how to not look like you work in a field. You sit. Today's lesson? Skin. And not just any skin. Pale, poreless, porcelain skin, the kind that makes people gasp and assume you were born of noble blood and powdered lilies. In medieval Europe, skin was the billboard of your social status. If it was pale, unblemished, and preferably glowing like you were already halfway to sainthood, people knew you were rich. That's the mainstream historical fact. Pale skin meant privilege. It meant you didn't labor under the sun, you ate delicate foods, and you were probably so well off, even your ailments were fashionable. But nature rarely cooperates with trends, so women, especially noble women, took matters into their own hands. You lean over to peek into the bowl. The mixture she's preparing? White lead paste, also known as Venetian ceruse. It promises to lighten the skin and even it out. The catch? It will eventually poison you. But hey, your cheeks will look flawless while your kidneys fail. She dips a linen pad into the paste and dabs your hand. It cools instantly, then tightens. You now feel like you've been dipped in chalk. Congratulations, you're closer to perfection, and further from survival. Fringe practices abounded. Women would coat their faces in egg whites for that taut, glossy look. Some even used snail slime, believing it cured blemishes and brightened the skin. Snails. Because if you can't be luminous naturally, maybe gastropod magic can help. You hear a whisper behind you. Another woman leans in and hands you a small vial. Mercury and rose water, she says with a wink. Only for special occasions. You do not open it. There were herbal alternatives too. Not everyone wanted to dip their face in poison. Cucumber pulp, almond milk, mashed strawberries, and vinegar infusions were used to reduce redness and soften the skin. But those were for peasants, or clever noblewomen who didn't want to die radiant. Historians still argue whether lead-based cosmetics were as widely used as records suggest. Some believe their popularity has been exaggerated due to the writings of moralists who condemned vanity. Others point to preserved recipe books and merchant records that show a booming trade in toxic beauty. Meanwhile, men had their own version of skincare, especially at court, where appearances mattered. Courtly gentlemen sometimes washed with lavender water, exfoliated with fine sand, or used milk to soften their hands. Calloused palms were the enemy of poetry, but the obsession with pale skin wasn't universal. In southern regions like Moorish Spain and Sicily, darker complexions were common and often romanticized in poetry and music. Olive skin there didn't mean peasant. It meant exotic allure, noble lineage, or poetic mystery. Context, again, is everything. Still, for most of Western Europe, fairness reigned supreme, and they were willing to go to extremes to maintain it. You watch as the woman next to you, noble, judging by her rings, leans over a copper mirror and examines her face. She sighs, picks up a soft cloth, and begins to scrub at a freckle near her chin. She whispers a small prayer as she does it. God, let my skin be a canvas for your light. A little intense, but welcome to medieval skincare. Sun exposure, meanwhile, was treated like a slow, creeping enemy. If you were caught with a tan, explanations were expected. I was praying at the shrine. The windows at Mass were open. A dog ran off with my hat. Anything but I was outside. To prevent such disgrace, women wore wide-brimmed hats, layers of veils, and sometimes even face-covering hoods when stepping outdoors. Think of it as early SPF, if SPF stood for some pale fantasy. One quirky remedy? To prevent sunspots, some women in Italy dabbed bat blood under their eyes before going to sleep. The logic behind this? Honestly, historians aren't sure. It probably didn't work. But it definitely made people avoid eye contact. And don't get started on blemishes. Pimples were seen as a sign of internal impurity. You'd pray them away, treat them with crushed mint or garlic paste, or, if desperate, cover them with tiny patches of lace dipped in egg white. That's right, medieval pimple patches. Ahead of their time and way less Instagrammable. You glance down at your own hands, stained slightly from handling herbs earlier. In this world, that mark says everything. Not noble. Not pampered. Not clean enough. Even your nails give you away. Short and clean? Maybe a nun. Long and slightly pink? Nobility. Bitten and cracked? You probably work with sheep. One servant walks by carrying a tray of crushed pearls. For the lady's bath, she mutters. Crushed pearls. Because nothing says I've got money like soaking in precious minerals while the rest of the castle skips their weekly rinse. There's a sudden flurry of footsteps. A courier arrives. He bows, presents a letter, and the women gasp. The queen's cousin is arriving for supper. Panic sets in. Powder, cloth, oil, perfume. Someone screams about a missing eyebrow pencil. Another person faints. Probably dramatic effect. But you? You're just sitting there, chalked hand, outstretched, quietly wondering whether a single face in this room will survive the century. The lengths they go to for pale perfection are heroic and horrifying. Still, there's beauty in the effort, in the rituals, in the shared knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, even if some of it involves vinegar foot baths and goat's milk toners. And as the sun shifts, lighting the room in amber, one older woman catches your eye. Her skin is lined, her freckles are many, and her smile is calm. She isn't powdered, isn't fussing, isn't glowing like porcelain. She simply is. And somehow that feels like the most beautiful thing you've seen all day. You find yourself drawn away from the scented oils and alabaster powders, down a narrow hallway where the smell turns sharper, more organic. Someone's just boiled something foul, and a heavy wooden door swings open to reveal a small side kitchen, or maybe a makeshift apothecary. Hanging from hooks above the hearth are strings of dried herbs, twigs, a rabbit foot, and, oddly, several cloves of garlic braided with what looks suspiciously like human hair. But the thing that captures your attention? A large silver goblet on the table filled with something dark. A woman leans over it, breathing into the cup. She gestures to you. For the breath, she says, of the nobles. Tonight we're talking teeth, mouths, and the surprising politics of breath. In a world without toothbrushes, toothpaste, or TikTok tutorials, your smile said everything about your status. Or lack thereof. If your teeth were white, straight-ish, and unchipped, it likely meant you had access to soft food, warm water, and someone in your household who knew how to boil mint. If they were blackened, missing, or coated in gunk, Well, let's just say no one was writing ballads about you. A mainstream historical fact? In most of medieval Europe, dental hygiene was rudimentary but not non-existent. Chew sticks, small twigs from aromatic trees like willow, birch, or hazel, were commonly used especially among the upper classes. You'd chew the end until it frayed into bristles, then scrub your teeth with it, possibly with some crushed mint, sage, or even salt rubbed in for extra abrasiveness. The result? Surprisingly effective. In fact, archaeological studies of medieval skeletons show that despite lacking modern tools, people often had fewer cavities than we do today. Why? No refined sugar, no sticky candy, no soda, no energy drinks. Just a lot of pottage, boiled vegetables, and the occasional roast. Your teeth, while yellow and rugged, weren't drowning in caramel corn like modern molars. And yet, medieval people were obsessed with breath. Halitosis could get you exiled from polite society. Monks wrote prayers about it. Court poets composed verses about the sweetness of a beloved's exhale. Her breath, like crushed violets and warm honey. Sure, dude. One quirky tidbit. Some nobles believed that rubbing your teeth with crushed emeralds would keep them clean and your breath pure. Did it work? Absolutely not. But it did make you sound fabulously wealthy at parties. Other remedies included rinsing with vinegar, chewing parsley or cloves, and, strangely, holding a pebble under your tongue for several hours a day. That last one, no explanation, just vibes. You sit by the hearth and examine a wooden comb hanging from a hook. It has tiny bristles on one side and looks suspiciously like a dental pick. A woman enters with a wooden bowl and spits something thick into it. She smiles. Myrtle paste, she explains. Tastes like rot, but the priest says my teeth look holy. Now, let's address the horror story, blackened teeth. Contrary to legend, medieval people didn't want black teeth. That particular trend came later, most notably in Japan's Heian period, where ohaguro, or tooth blackening, was considered beautiful. But in Europe, black teeth meant decay, sickness, or too much wine, and not enough willow twigs. But here's where things get tricky. Historians still argue whether certain medieval monarchs, particularly Henry VII and some Spanish nobles, intentionally darkened their teeth using herbs and burnt clove oil to emulate aging or wisdom. It's speculative, but not impossible. After all, a dark smile might have made you seem worldly, or at least not 12. Meanwhile, among peasants, dental health was rougher. Without access to the spices or rinse waters of the court, many relied on chewing roots, wiping their teeth with coarse linen, or doing nothing. Gums bled. Teeth fell out. Breath killed conversations. But no one expected peasants to be kissable. You glance into a small mirror set into the wall. Your own reflection. Teeth a bit crooked, one suspicious molar makes you flinch. Would you survive the breath test? Probably not. Especially not in a room filled with garlic, rabbit fur, and what is very clearly a toad skull. There's a brief commotion as a physician enters, cloak billowing like he owns the place. He carries a pouch of herbs and a bag of powdered charcoal. For whitening, he says, handing it to a young woman who's nervously checking her teeth in a spoon. She sprinkles some onto her cloth and begins scrubbing with the intensity of someone preparing for a royal audience. Or maybe just a really cute knight. Speaking of knights, male beauty standards didn't let them off the dental hook either. A handsome warrior needed strong teeth, not just for appearance, but for survival. You try swinging a sword with a toothache, as it's not romantic. So knights often chewed birch bark to clean their mouths and packed aching teeth with honey, mint, or even lead. Pellets. The last one? Not advisable. And when things got really bad, tooth pullers. Traveling dentists who showed up at fairs with a pair of pliers and a strong arm. No anesthetic, just a drum roll and a crowd. If that doesn't make you grateful for modern dentistry, nothing will. You hear laughter from the next room. A nobleman has just cracked a joke about his wife's breath scaring the falcons. Everyone chuckles except the wife, who casually sips from a silver goblet filled with sage water. Revenge, you sense, will be herbal and slow. There's also a small vial on a shelf labeled Draconis Salvia. Dragon's breath. You ask, and someone tells you it's just a mix of cinnamon, clove oil, and vinegar. But the name? Flawless branding. Even among clergy, mouth rituals mattered. Monks and nuns chewed fennel to sweeten their breath before confession. Some even believed foul breath was a sign of moral decay, a physical stench of sin. You suddenly feel very self-conscious. As night begins to fall, someone lights a candle near the hearth. The room smells faintly of cloves, ashes, and roasted apples. A young girl hands you a pouch filled with dried herbs. Chew one before bed, she says. If you dream sweet, your soul is clean. You pocket the pouch, and as the manor settles into silence, you realize that in this world, even something as simple as your breath carried weight. Status, holiness, desire. So next time you brush your teeth, whisper a small thank you. For fluoride, for mint, and for not having to rub your gums with emerald dust before flirting with your crush. You wake to soft light spilling through a diamond-paned window. Somewhere in the manor, a rooster crows far too enthusiastically, and bells ring in the chapel tower. It's a new day in medieval life, and you still haven't figured out where to put your eyebrows. A young servant girl enters your room and sets down a tray. Porridge, a boiled egg, and a thin slice of apple. Next to it, a tiny mirror and a stick of charcoal. Because this morning isn't about breakfast, it's about eyes, and the battlefield of beauty waged upon them. You move toward the mirror and take stock. Your eyes are puffy, your brows wild, your lashes basically invisible. Welcome to the reality of medieval makeup, where the goal wasn't to enhance your features, it was to downplay them. Or more specifically, to look meek, modest, and absolutely not seductive, unless you were in a painting, or married, or a queen. Sometimes. Let's start with the eyebrows. Mainstream historical fact, throughout much of medieval Europe, the ideal brow was either extremely thin or entirely absent. The thinner your brow, the more virtuous you appeared. Eyebrows were seen as distracting, like bold punctuation marks on a holy text. So naturally, women plucked them down to little wisps, or erased them entirely, often with pumice stones or harsh herbs that burned as much as they removed. And that's not all. The ideal look also called for soft, dreamy eyes, not big and expressive, but downturned, gentle, pious. Eyes that said, I've never even looked at a man. Not, I'll devour your soul and your estate. You pick up the charcoal stick. It's not eyeliner, not really, but it'll do. Medieval women used all sorts of things to define their eyes just enough to make them glow under candlelight. Burnt almonds, soot, crushed antimony, even lamp black scraped from the bottom of oil lamps. You try not to imagine what's living in that powder as you line your lashes. A quirky tidbit? In some parts of Europe, especially Italy, it was fashionable for women to apply belladonna, yes, the deadly nightshade, to their eyes. Why? It dilated the pupils, creating a soft, glistening look associated with love and innocence. But too much? Well, blindness. Beauty is blurry, apparently. Still, that modest glow look didn't just apply to the eyes. The surrounding area mattered too. Some women lightened their eyelids with pearl dust or pale chalk, then rubbed rose petals on their temples for a blushed with virtue vibe. There were no smoky eyes, no bold cat wings. Just subdued, sacred softness. Historians still argue whether the average medieval woman wore makeup at all. Some sources suggest that outside court circles, makeup was rare, reserved for brides or feast days. Others argue that subtle enhancement was more common than previously thought, especially among merchant women who wanted to appear refined without being scandalous. And yes, there were scandals. Church leaders often condemned makeup as a form of deception. To paint your face was to mock God's creation. To draw attention to your eyes was to invite sin. But many women pushed back. They framed their beauty routines as acts of cleanliness, reverence, even devotion. Is it not holy, one wrote, to appear as the angels might? You peer at your own reflection now, charcoal smudged slightly at the corner. A soft brush of lavender oil beneath the eyes. The result? You still look exhausted. But like, expensive exhausted. That's something. Meanwhile, outside the noble halls, peasant women approached eye care differently. They bathed their eyes in cold well water or chamomile to reduce puffiness from smoke and dust. Some believed a tea made from cornflower blossoms could brighten the gaze. It probably didn't, but it sounds nice, doesn't it? For men, eyes were symbols of insight and strength. A knight with sharp eyes was said to possess wisdom, vision, and the ability to read a battlefield, or a woman's heart. The poet's gaze was equally revered. You imagine some poor troubadour sitting by candlelight, dabbing rosewater beneath his eyes before composing yet another sonnet to Lady Eleanor's eyes like dew on early violets. Of course, if you had a lazy eye or one smaller than the other, society wasn't kind. These features could mark you as bewitched, unlucky, or morally suspicious. And don't even get started on squinting. That could suggest deceit. As you exit your room and head toward the Great Hall, you pass by a group of young girls applying a mixture of egg white and alum around their eyes. It lifts, one whispers. The priest's niece swears by it. You pretend not to hear them mutter about the woman whose eyes were so wide and luminous that a man proposed on the spot. She blinked, and he fainted, one says. You sit near the window, watching light play across the stone floor. Another woman is sketching in the corner, eyes nothing but eyes. Big, sad ones. Wide, glistening ones. Hooded, humble ones. In medieval art, eyes carried emotion, status, even salvation. A saint's eyes were often upturned, almost glazed. A witch's eyes? Piercing, wild, wide open. In fact, one of the common accusations against women suspected of sorcery was that they had bewitching eyes. Eyes that could lure a man, steal a child, or curse a cow. Imagine having a bad day with your eyeliner and being burned for it. And yet, the beauty standard persisted. Soft, rounded, almost sleepy eyes that suggested virtue. You weren't supposed to look at people. You were supposed to glance, to peer, to lower your gaze like you were trying to see your soul. A girl nearby turns to you, eyes lined just slightly with ash and coal. "Do I look innocent?" she asks. You nod. She smiles, not modestly, not piously, but with teeth and mischief. Some things you suspect transcend the age. And as bells ring again for midday prayers, you find yourself thinking about your own eyes. How they reflect not just the world, but the rules of it. How one blink, one raised brow, one glance could change the game. In the medieval world, you didn't just see beauty. You were it, or you weren't. And sometimes it all came down to a single look. You step out into the courtyard just as the chapel bell tolls noon. The sun is high, the breeze is light, and the cobblestones are warm beneath your feet. Around you, the manor stirs with life. Servants hustle with baskets of herbs. Pages chase one another with wooden swords, and a pair of noblewomen glide past with impossible elegance, their sleeves trailing like river silk. And then it hits you. Everyone here looks like they were painted by a very picky angel. Not just the faces, the shapes, the silhouettes. The way their bodies move beneath layers of linen, brocade, and carefully tied girdles. Today's lesson: body shape and posture. The silent architecture of medieval beauty. You follow the women into the gardens, and as you do, you notice how they walk. Upright, shoulders back, chins lowered. Graceful, contained, almost slow motion. Because in the world of medieval beauty, how you moved was just as important as how you looked. Let's break it down. The mainstream historical ideal for women's bodies was long, slender, and modestly curved. Think willowy. Think candle with hips. Plumpness wasn't necessarily undesirable, but there was a type of plumpness that was approved. Soft, gentle, never excessive. Just enough to say, I've never missed a meal, but I've also never run. And your waist? Tiny, ideally. Though corsets in the strict whalebone sense didn't become widespread until later centuries, medieval women did use lacing, girdles, and tight kirtles to suggest a delicate middle. You wanted to look upright, contained, composed, like a saint balancing a bowl of milk on her head without spilling a drop. Here's your mainstream fact. Noblewomen often wore multiple layers, not just for warmth, but to sculpt the body into a fashionable silhouette. A tightly fitted underdress, called a cote or kirtle, followed by a looser gown, then perhaps a belt or girdle to draw on the waist and flare out the hips. It's fashion, but it's also math. Fabric plus pressure equals prestige. You pass a small group of girls walking with books balanced on their heads. A punishment? Nope. Just posture training, because slouching meant you were lazy, or worse, worldly. Meanwhile, among peasant women, the ideals were different. Strength was admired. Thick arms, wide hips, and strong legs were signs of capability and fertility. If you could carry 2 buckets and climb a ladder in skirts, you were beautiful. Not just desirable, necessary. Their beauty wasn't quiet and soft. It was noisy, laughing, sunburnt beauty. The kind that smells like bread and iron? A quirky tidbit? In some regions, it was fashionable to have a slight stoop to your posture, especially in religious contexts. Why? It signaled humility. A woman who looked permanently on the verge of prayer was clearly closer to heaven. You sit on a carved stone bench near the herb garden, where a noblewoman is lacing her bodice tighter. She's whispering a rhyme as she does it, something about grace like vines and a waist like thread. Her maid tightens the cord with practiced hands. There's a grunt, a wince, and finally the desired shape. Upright, smooth, and vaguely breathless. Historians still argue whether these body ideals were genuinely widespread or mostly aspirational. After all, most medieval artwork was created by men, commissioned by churches or nobles, and filtered through religious ideals. Did everyday people really strive for these shapes? Or were they simply playing dress-up for power? You glance across the garden and see a young knight adjusting his belt. Time to talk about masculine body ideals. The perfect man, according to the medieval aesthetic, was tall, obviously, broad-shouldered with a narrow waist and strong limbs. Basically, shaped like a triangle with legs. Knights trained relentlessly to maintain that physique, not just for battle, but for courtly admiration. Armor wasn't just protection, it was body contouring. And then there's the poet knight type. Less brawny, more broody. A slender frame, gentle hands, melancholy eyes. He's the one reciting verses beneath your balcony. His beauty is in his restraint, his posture, his ability to look tragic in candlelight. A group of boys jog past, barefoot, laughing, chasing each other with wooden spoons. One stops, lifts his tunic, and flexes his skinny arms proudly. His friends laugh. He might not fit the ideal yet, but give him time. By 17, he'll be expected to carry 60 pounds of armor and ride a war horse without falling off. You notice something else. The stillness. Among the nobles, movement is controlled. No wild gestures, no hopping from one foot to the other. You're supposed to float, not flail. Women sit with ankles crossed, hands folded, necks elongated like swans who've studied etiquette. Even laughter is delicate, filtered through fingers. A maid spills a basket of apples and one rolls to your feet. You bend to pick it up, too fast, and immediately feel the stares. You forgot to float. Tragic. But not all beauty was about shape. Smell mattered too. You can't look like a rose and smell like goat. Many noble women tucked sprigs of lavender or rosemary into their sleeves or braided them into their hair. Some even wore small pouches of herbs tied to their girdles. Medieval body spray, basically. Peasants did the same, but with whatever herbs they had access to. Basil, mint, mugwort, sage. Just enough to say, yes, I smell like the forest, but on purpose. You pause under an arbor where a woman rests, her face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. Her figure is tall, draped in soft greens and pale blues. She's not quite thin, not quite curvy, but the way she sits. Poetry. Her pose is deliberate, practiced, like she knows the weight of her own gaze. And that's the secret. In medieval beauty, posture and body shape weren't about bone structure or genetics. They were performed. You learned to hold yourself like art, and in that stillness you declared your place in the world. You rise slowly this time, shoulders back, neck long, feet aligned, and as you walk across the garden, you feel it. That strange pressure. The gaze of history, of expectation, of beauty etched into stone and scripture. You're not just walking, you're being watched by time itself. And honey, you're absolutely serving. The bells toll again, this time slower. 4 steady chimes that echo across the manor and into the fields beyond. It's late afternoon now, and the day has softened into that warm, golden hour. The kind that makes every blemish look like a blessing, and even the sheep seem well groomed. You wander toward the servants' wing, following the trail of dried lavender and cracked rose petals strewn across the stone floor. The air changes here. Less incense, more vinegar. Less perfume, more cloves? You're not quite sure. But what's clear is that you've entered the olfactory battleground of medieval life. Today we talk scent, how people smelled, how they wanted to smell, and how they covered up the brutal reality that... Let's be honest, hygiene was not exactly winning in this century. Let's get this out of the way. Bathing was rare, not non-existent, but infrequent, especially among the nobility. Yes, the peasants bathed more often, usually in rivers, streams, or makeshift tubs, but they didn't write the poems or set the trends. Nobles feared water, not the symbolic kind, actual water. The belief was that bathing opened the pores and allowed illness to seep into the body. You weren't clean after a bath, you were vulnerable. Instead, they turned to perfume. But not perfume as we know it. There were no atomizers, no Chanel No. 5. Just oils, herbs, and a lot of trial and error. Mainstream historical fact? Many medieval people wore pomanders, small perforated balls of metal or wood filled with herbs, dried flowers, and occasionally exotic spices. These were hung around the neck or fastened to belts, especially during outbreaks of disease. Not just to mask odor, but to protect the body from bad air, which they believed caused sickness. You spot one now hanging from a lady's girdle as she walks by. It swings with each step, releasing a faint trace of cinnamon and marjoram. Expensive scents, imported with difficulty, prized like jewels. She probably doesn't even know how much her belt is worth in herbs alone. A servant beside you, catching your curious glance, offers her own version, a little linen sachet filled with dried mint and crushed pine needles. Makes your breath smell like the forest, she says proudly. Okay, even if your mouth smells like cheese. Which brings us to underarms. No deodorant? No problem. Many people rubbed vinegar, alum, or powdered lime under their arms. Alum, a naturally occurring salt compound, was surprisingly effective. It killed bacteria, neutralized odor, and left a faint mineral tang. Plus, it made you feel like you were doing science. Medieval science, anyway. For those who wanted to go above and beyond, there were scented oils made from lavender, myrtle, or rosemary, rubbed into the skin after light washing, when you could find warm water, which wasn't often. A quirky tidbit? In France, it was fashionable among noblewomen to wash only their hands and face daily, but to powder the rest of the body with rice flour mixed with rose petals. One enterprising duchess even developed a scented dusting cloak, lined with crushed herbs, that she wore for an hour every morning to absorb body odors. It didn't work, but it was very chic. Now, you might be asking, how bad did everyone smell? Well, that depends. If you were a tanner, a fishmonger, or a field hand, the answer is bad. If you were a monk, probably like beeswax and parchment. If you were nobility, like a desperate mix of roses, urine, and fear. Because yes, some beauty recipes did involve urine, especially from young boys. Allegedly purifying, definitely not recommended. Historians still argue whether the upper classes truly believed they smelled good, or if they just didn't have a frame of reference. After all, when the bar is not actively rotting, a dash of rosemary goes a long way. You follow a line of maids into a side room. It's a kind of scent workshop, a chaos of basins, pots, petals, and sticky oils. They're preparing a special batch of perfume for a feast that night. The ingredients: orange peel, rosewater, cloves, honey, and a touch of musk scraped from the glands of some unfortunate animal. Don't ask which one. You don't want to know. One girl is grinding dried lavender with a bit of myrrh. She hands you the mixture, instructing you to breathe deeply. You do, and it's oddly calming. Floral, earthy, ancient. You smell like someone who definitely doesn't chase pigs for a living. For men, scent was also important, especially knights and courtiers. A knight in shining armor who smelled like boiled cabbage wasn't winning hearts. So they applied perfumes to their gloves, their tunics, even the linings of their helmets. Yes, helmet perfume. Because nothing says battle-ready like lilac-scented steel. A knight near the stables wipes down his armor with a cloth soaked in rose vinegar. Keeps the rust off, he explains, and the ladies on. He winks. You retreat. But scent wasn't just about romance or vanity. It was political. A well-scented person signaled wealth, refinement, and godliness. Saints were said to leave behind sweet smells after death, the odor of sanctity. And if you wanted to emulate a saint, you wore the herbs associated with them: rosemary for Mary, frankincense for the Magi, and mint for cleanliness of spirit. You pass by a young woman hanging linens, and the breeze catches her scent. Lemongrass and sage. Simple, natural. She doesn't wear jewelry, her dress is plain, but for a moment she turns more heads than the jeweled duchess in the corner. Because in this world, scent tells stories words can't. A priest walks by, pinching his nose at a stable boy. He mutters something about the sin of sloth and the devil's armpit. The boy, unbothered, lifts a small pouch from his belt and shakes it mockingly. Mint leaves inside. Even the devil needs seasoning, he quips. And as the sun begins to sink, shadows stretching across the courtyard, you breathe deeply again. Beneath the stink of sweat, smoke, and stable, you catch notes of marjoram, thyme, and lavender. It's not clean by modern standards, but it's alive, human, honest. You realize that in this world, scent isn't just about masking, it's about memory, protection, power. So you tuck a few sprigs of rosemary into your collar, dab a drop of lavender oil on your wrist, and prepare to face the evening like a well-scented warrior. As twilight falls over the manor, the great hall begins to fill. Tapestries sway in the draft from the high windows, and torchlight flickers across polished flagstones. The air smells of roast pheasant, mead, and a whole lot of ambition. This isn't just dinner, it's a social theater. And if you think beauty routines end with cheeks and scent, buckle up. Tonight we dive into the final layer of medieval allure: adornment, jewels, accessories, wigs, and the art of faking nobility without getting executed. The main thing to understand here is this: in the medieval world, what you wore and how you wore it could completely transform your perceived status. More than hair, more than skin, more than a symmetrical face, accessories were magic. They elevated, concealed, performed. A mainstream historical fact? Sumptuary laws, actual legal restrictions, governed who could wear what. These laws dictated everything from fabric type to jewel count to how many fur trims were allowed on a single sleeve. Why? Because appearance was so powerful, the nobility feared imposters. You couldn't let just anyone walk around looking expensive. You settle onto a long bench near the entrance and observe as the guests arrive. The noble women are radiant. Their girdles glint with tiny bells and gemstones. Necklines are high and modest, or low and debatably pious, depending on the kingdom. Sleeves droop like swan wings, some embroidered with gold thread, others lined with rabbit fur or ermine. Illegal for most people, by the way, unless you were at least a duchess. And perched atop every head? A small architectural miracle. Jeweled nets, gauze turbans, coiled veils, or, your personal favorite, a circlet of gold shaped like tiny intertwined birds. And then, there's the hair. You lean in as a young woman passes. She's wearing a full wig of auburn curls. It's clearly horsehair, but styled impeccably, powdered lightly and wrapped in a net of silk threads dyed saffron yellow. The effect? Regal. Not quite natural. But let's be real, no one's buying that it's her hair. And that's the point. Wigs were incredibly popular in certain medieval circles, especially when hair loss from illness, or more often over plucking, became too obvious. Wigs allowed women to maintain the illusion of health, youth, and most importantly, nobility. Bonus: they doubled as secret compartments. A few love notes tucked under the coils? Cheeky, risky, very on brand for court. A quirky tidbit? Some noblewomen in late 14th century France wore wigs made entirely of dyed silk thread, woven to resemble waterfalls or clouds. One even commissioned a wig shaped like a flaming torch. Fashion? Yes. Fire hazard? Also yes. You glance down the hall and spot someone who doesn't quite fit. Her dress is rich but ever so slightly out of date. Her necklace? Stunning, but one of the stones is clearly paste. Her veil is too long for her station, and her shoes, decorated with pearls, definitely violate at least 3 sumptuary clauses. She is, without a doubt, pretending to be someone she's not, and she's doing it well. Faking nobility was a game played carefully. Wear just enough to impress, but not enough to draw attention from someone who actually could have you arrested. It was a high-wire act. Dress above your station, and you might get a better match, more respect, more invitations. But if you got caught, public humiliation, maybe worse. Historians still argue whether these imposters were common or exceptional. Some point to records of market women who saved for years just to afford one velvet gown. Others suggest that borrowing or renting garments for festivals was common. And in cities like Venice or Paris, with their carnival culture and class fluidity, the line between merchant and noble could get deliciously blurry. The men weren't slacking either. A young lord walks past in a tunic stitched with gold thread, a sapphire pin at his collar. His gloves are perfumed, yes, that's a thing, and his hat bears a long feather dyed black, a subtle flex indicating both mourning and power. Accessory game. Strong. But the real power play? Rings. Rings signified everything. Family, wealth, allegiance, even mood. A man could wear 6 on one hand if he was bold enough. The richer you were, the more likely you wore your wealth on your fingers. And also possibly used them to deliver poisoned wine, but that's a different video. You're handed a small goblet of mead, and as you sip, your seatmate, a woman in an understated linen gown, leans over and lifts the hem of her dress ever so slightly. "See," she whispers. The lining is silk, illegal for her class. "It's just the lining," she adds. No one can arrest a lining. She winks. You adore her. There's also a strange but clever trend emerging at the far end of the hall. Fake jewelry. Glass beads painted to resemble rubies. Shell fragments polished like ivory. Gilded pewter pretending to be gold. Entire industries sprang up around imitation, because sometimes looking wealthy was more important than being wealthy. And while we're here, let's talk girdles. No, not corsets. Belt girdles. Decorative, often bejeweled, they dangled around the hips and sometimes featured little purses or charms. A popular gift from husband to wife, they were equal parts fashion and message. I can afford you. Romantic, in a very capitalistic way. A fringe trend? Religious accessories as status symbols. Wearing a brooch shaped like a saint's relic or a veil embroidered with psalms was seen as both holy and stylish. And yes, it was often more about flexing piety than being pious. The banquet begins. Plates clatter, voices rise. You watch as people size each other up, not by their beauty, but by their details. The clasp on a cloak, the die in a sleeve, the pattern on a ring. This is no ordinary feast. It's an inventory. Because in this world, beauty isn't just about the body. It's about the frame, the packaging, the story you tell with what you wear and how well you lie with it. You glance down at your own garb. Dusty boots, wrinkled tunic. No rings, no brooch. And suddenly it's not just that you don't belong, it's that everyone knows. But then, across the room, the woman with the out-of-date dress catches your eye again. She raises her goblet to you silently. The message is clear. We're all faking something. And with that, the game continues. You slip out of the banquet hall just as the musicians begin their fourth round of that one song everyone knows but no one likes. The evening air is cool and heavy with wood smoke, and you wander toward the training grounds, drawn by the rhythmic clang of metal and the occasional triumphant yell. Tonight, you leave the perfume and pearls behind and step into the world of masculine beauty, where sweat is seductive, battle scars are bragging rights, and yes, even beards had politics. Let's start with the basics. In medieval Europe, the ideal man was a balance between strength and grace. Not just a brute, but a chivalrous brute. Think poetry and pummeling. A warrior with feelings. A monk with abs. A knight who can recite Virgil, then break a lance over your boyfriend's horse. The mainstream historical fact? Physical ideals for men changed across regions and eras, but one thing stayed consistent. Sun-kissed skin was not frowned upon for men the way it was for women. In fact, a tanned face on a man often implied vigor, outdoor strength, and a life of noble action. Pale knights existed in paintings, sure, but the real heartthrobs, the ones who rode into town covered in dust and glory, they were bronze as a turkey leg and proud of it. You watch two squires sparring in the dirt. Their sleeves are rolled up, forearms like tree roots, faces streaked with sweat. They look nothing like the polished portraits inside the manor, and yet, people are watching them with the kind of focus usually reserved for saints and royalty. Beards, though. Let's talk about beards. A full, well-groomed beard signaled maturity, wisdom, and masculinity. Many kings were drawn with grand facial hair, trimmed to perfection or flowing like divine shrubbery. But there were rules. Unkempt beards suggested wildness, barbarity even. Too short? Vanity. Clean-shaven. Only acceptable if you were a young page, a priest, or painfully French. A quirky tidbit? Some knights actually scented their beards with herbs before tournaments. Basil for bravery, lavender for luck. One infamous duke was said to braid his with thin silver wires and tuck small coins inside, for the jingle of intimidation. Historians still argue whether beard trends followed political tides. Clean-shaven faces surged in monastic orders and scholarly circles, especially where religious influence was strong. Meanwhile, warrior cultures like Norman lords or the Teutonic Knights favored facial hair as part of their identity. Your chin didn't just hold your jawline, it held your rank. Hair, of course, played a role too. Shoulder-length locks were common among noblemen, often curled or brushed with perfumed oil. A good head of hair showed you weren't sick, starving, or riddled with lice. And yes, men absolutely cared about their hairline. A young man nearby is adjusting a thin leather headband, pushing his hair back to reveal what's left of his widow's peak. You catch him rubbing his scalp with a mixture of rosemary and vinegar, rumored to stimulate growth. Or at least make your head smell aggressive enough to distract from the balding. And let's not forget eyes. The ideal male gaze was sharp. Not wide-eyed and innocent, but focused, slightly narrowed. Like you were always contemplating war, poetry, or both. He looks like he's about to recite an epic and win a duel, a young woman near you says dreamily. The squire she's watching immediately trips over his sword. Romance is hard. Body type? Tall, naturally. Broad-shouldered, narrow-waisted, and well-muscled, without looking like you tried too hard. Functional strength was favored over decorative muscles. You had to look like you could lift a sword or carry a wounded friend, not like you spent all day flexing in a fountain. Clothing played into the performance, too. Men of status wore doublets fitted to show off their shoulders and cinch the waist, boots that made them look taller, and belts slung just low enough to hint at confidence, but high enough to avoid indecency. The goal, command attention, then deny it with polite restraint. And speaking of restraint, we must mention manners. Chivalry was a full-body aesthetic. The way a man moved, bowed, gestured, all mattered. A beautiful man didn't just look noble, he behaved nobly. That meant slow, deliberate movements. No flailing, no slouching, no sudden bursts of laughter unless accompanied by a well-timed smirk. You watch an older knight cross the yard, pausing to help a maid pick up a fallen basket. His movements are precise, practiced, like he's been trained not only in swordplay but in theatrical kindness. The maid blushes. You kinda do too. Now, not all men met the ideal, but that didn't stop them from trying. One young merchant in the manor wears padded sleeves to make his arms look thicker. Another wears heeled shoes to add height, a risky move on cobblestone. A third rubs berry juice into his lips to look more youthful, though the result is less courtly troubadour and more small vampire with regrets. A fringe case? A group of wealthy men who carried small hand mirrors in their belts. Not for vanity, but for self-discipline. If they caught themselves looking tired or crooked, they would correct their posture to reflect their soul. Which is a fancy way of saying, no one wants to look ugly while praying. And of course, all this effort wasn't just about beauty. It was about power, status, marriages, leadership. A man's appearance could win him a seat at court, or exile him to the stables. A noble woman passing by nods toward one of the squires and whispers, "He looks strong." Her friend replies, "Strong, but too much nose." Even in this world, the nose discourse is eternal. You sit near the practice yard as the stars begin to appear overhead. One of the squires, sweat-soaked and smiling, collapses beside you. "Do I look noble yet?" he asks, half laughing. You study his face. Bent nose, chipped tooth, uneven beard. But there's something about the way he smiles, open, unguarded, that makes you wonder if this whole idea of masculine beauty is less about being perfect and more about being seen trying. So, you nod. Close enough. The moon rises higher, casting silver light over the manor like soft lace laid across an old book. The feast is winding down now. Guests begin to drift from the hall, and laughter fades into the hush of prayers, footsteps, and the distant creak of gates locking for the night. You slip quietly into the chapel, cool, quiet, lit only by flickering votives. Candles line the altar, each one melting slowly into small golden pools. And there, kneeling in the shadows, is a woman. Not richly dressed, not powdered or painted. Her head is bowed and her veil is simple. She doesn't turn when you enter, but you don't need her to. She's here for the part of beauty no mirror can measure. Tonight you walk the line between vanity and virtue, where beauty meets religion, and the church becomes both your critic and your stylist. This was not a world where you could just be beautiful without consequence. Beauty was dangerous, tempting, distracting, and at the same time, divine, a reflection of God's glory, or maybe the devil's trap, depending on who you asked. Let's begin with the mainstream historical fact. The medieval church held very clear, very complicated opinions about physical beauty. On one hand, it was a gift from God, proof of his favor. Saints were often described as radiant, glowing, otherworldly in their grace. Their physical perfection wasn't sinful, it was holy. But on the other hand, to care too much about your appearance was to risk vanity, one of the 7 deadly sins. To enhance your beauty was to lie, to attract desire, a form of spiritual violence. A woman who lined her eyes or brightened her cheeks might as well have drawn a pentagram. This contradiction kept people dancing on a knife's edge. You walk along the nave and spot a stone statue of the Virgin Mary, her robes delicately carved, her face serene. She's beautiful, impossibly so. High cheekbones, smooth skin, a gaze that's both knowing and soft. But beneath her feet is a snake. Always the tension, beauty and danger, heaven and temptation. A monk shuffles past you, coughing quietly. He mutters something under his breath. The body is dust. The spirit is fire, and disappears into the sacristy. You suspect he hasn't looked at a woman in 20 years, but he definitely has opinions. A quirky tidbit? In some convents, young nuns were discouraged from even looking at their own reflections. Mirrors were banned or covered, not out of humility, but to prevent inner distraction. If you caught your own eye too long, the devil might sneak in behind it. Still, women found ways to maintain dignity, and yes, beauty, within these moral boundaries. Simple oils, rosewater rinses, embroidered veils that drew the eye upward toward the soul. Even the act of braiding hair could be devotional if done with a prayer whispered through the fingers. You sit in a wooden pew, listening to the whispering echo of evening prayers and wonder, how much did women actually believe they were sinning when they painted their lips with berry juice or lightened their cheeks with chalk? Historians still argue over it. Some say the guilt was real, internalized by years of sermons and scriptures that framed beauty as a trap. Others believe women were far more pragmatic. God made roses, didn't he? One 14th century poem quips. Then why not bloom where he planted you? The church also policed men, of course. Excessive grooming, vanity, and clothing. Even scented gloves were frowned upon for the devout. One bishop famously declared that a man who wore dyed shoes was married to his pride, and therefore unfit to lead anything more sacred than a chicken. And yet, behind closed doors, even clergy weren't immune. There are accounts of abbots who hoarded French perfumes, monks who collected ivory combs, and nuns who secretly traded rose oil recipes by candlelight. Faith was powerful, but so was the urge to smell nice. You glance back toward the altar and notice a fresco, barely visible in the candlelight, of Saint Agnes. She's young, beautiful, eyes raised to heaven, hair flowing in golden waves. She holds a lamb and a palm frond, but around her are flames, spears, and staring men. Her beauty made her a saint and a target. That's the brutal truth. In many medieval stories, a woman's beauty wasn't a blessing, it was her downfall. The reason she was tempted, tested, tortured. In hagiographies, those long, poetic tales of saintly suffering, female saints are described in vivid, glowing terms, and then immediately set on fire. Even in more earthly settings, beauty was weaponized. A woman who drew too much attention could be shamed for seduction. If her husband fell into temptation, clearly it was her fault. If a priest faltered in his vow of chastity, surely her eyes were the snare. You see where this is going. A fringe case? One early 15th century woman was brought before her village priest and accused of spiritual vanity because she regularly rinsed her hair with sage-infused beer and wore a coral necklace blessed by a traveling friar. Her response? Would you rather I came to church stinking like turnips? Legend! You notice a young novitiate lighting candles at the front of the chapel. Her hands are red from scrubbing, her veil is crooked. Her expression is tired but kind. She's not beautiful in the way poets describe, but there's something luminous about her still. And that's the final twist. In this era, some believed that true beauty couldn't be applied or crafted. It had to radiate. A beauty of the soul so intense it bent the physical world around it. A beauty so pure it couldn't be contained by wrinkles, scars, or soot. You sit in the dim silence, letting the candlelight warm your face. No one's watching you. There's no mirror, no judgment, no powder to apply. Just you. And your breath. And the soft echo of centuries arguing over whether beauty was heaven's reward or hell's bait. The chapel doors creak open behind you. A gust of cooler night air rolls in, rustling the flames of the votive candles like nervous whispers. You step back into the moonlit courtyard, only now the manor feels different. Quieter, heavier, like it's holding its breath. Because as beautiful as the medieval world pretended to be, with its polished veils and powdered cheeks, there was always a darker truth lurking in the shadows. Tonight, we leave the rosewater and embroidery behind and talk about the danger of being beautiful. Specifically, when beauty wasn't a blessing, but a curse. You cross into the outer yard, near the gardens, where torches flicker beside a worn wooden post. A place used occasionally for public punishments. It's quiet now, but you can't help imagining the shouts that once echoed here. The accusations, the judgment, the fire. Here's your mainstream historical fact. During the late medieval period, particularly from the 14th century onward, the fear of witches, real or imagined, began to rise dramatically. And one of the common traits attributed to suspected witches? Beauty. Yes. The same radiant, glowing, graceful appearance praised in court poetry could suddenly mark you as dangerous, temptress, sorceress, she-devil in velvet. Why? Because beauty made people uncomfortable, especially when it couldn't be explained by wealth or birth. If a poor girl had glowing skin, she must have made a deal with something dark. If a widow remained alluring, surely she was bewitching young men. And if a midwife helped too many women survive childbirth, well, that was unnatural. You pass by a row of drying herbs, sage, lavender, yarrow. A woman tending them glances up quickly, then back down. She works fast, quiet, careful not to meet your eye too long. Women like her knew how fast admiration could turn to suspicion. A quirky tidbit. In some towns, women were warned not to braid their hair too elaborately for fear it could be mistaken for magical knots. One poor soul in 1423 was accused of binding the winds with her braids because a local boat capsized, and apparently that was her fault. And if you're thinking this only happened in remote villages or hysterical mobs, think again. In royal courts and among the wealthy, whispers were just as deadly. A lady whose suitor died unexpectedly? Clearly cursed. A beauty who never aged? Must be using witchcraft. There are records of noblewomen being banished, or worse, for simply looking too well after 40. Historians still argue whether beauty truly made women more vulnerable to accusations, or whether the beauty itself was a scapegoat for power, jealousy, or politics. What's certain is this. Beautiful women walked a razor's edge. Adored one day, burned the next. You turn a corner and find yourself at the edge of the orchard. The moonlight filters through bare branches, turning everything silver and brittle. In the distance, a group of girls are huddled in a circle, giggling softly. One is telling fortunes, holding a mirror and a candle, reciting something in Latin that probably isn't Latin. Careful, you say with a smirk. That's how witches get started. They laugh, but one girl steps back, suddenly unsure. She glances toward the manor. Even now, the fear lingers, and not just for women. Men, too, could be accused, though far less often, and usually for being strange, not beautiful. Beauty was uniquely perilous for women, especially when it couldn't be controlled. A woman who knew her power? Frightening. A woman who used it? Deadly. One chilling account from 1478 tells of a healer in Germany whose only crime was having too many clients. She was described as bright-eyed and youthful of face, despite being nearly 50. That was enough. She was tried, tortured, and burned. Her skin had glowed, they said. Her breath had smelled of lilies, the devil's perfume. You walk past a stone well and peer inside. Your reflection wavers on the surface, strangely distorted by the moonlight. In another century, another town, someone might see that and wonder if you were something other than human. Because beauty, when unexplained, when inconvenient, when too strong, became suspicious. It suggested influence, seduction, power over men. And medieval society wasn't built to handle women with power. A fringe detail? In some parts of Eastern Europe, women accused of sorcery were shaved completely, head to toe, before trial, to remove any possible magical hairs. Then they were dunked in cold water. If they sank, they were innocent, but often dead. If they floated, guilty and punished. Either way, not ideal. You hear a soft bell in the distance, midnight prayers, but no one moves. Even the birds are quiet now. It's a sacred hour, yes, but also the hour associated with magic, according to the old folk songs. The witching hour, when beauty glows too brightly, shadows twist too long, and mirrors whisper instead of reflect. You sit on a fallen log beside the orchard, trying to imagine what it felt like to be a young woman in a small village, face glowing from a berry-tinted balm, hair braided just a little too carefully. Someone's jealous wife whispering your name behind closed shutters. It didn't take much. A pretty face plus a bad harvest equals blame. A strong perfume plus a weak marriage equals suspicion. A knowing smile plus a town full of secrets equals firewood. And so many women dimmed their beauty, covered their hair, stopped smiling too easily. Some gave up herbs, others gave up hope, but some didn't. There were those who leaned into it, who painted their lips, wore their lace, and dared the world to come for them. Sometimes they survived, sometimes they didn't. But they left behind stories, names, and the undeniable truth that beauty in the wrong place at the wrong time wasn't a compliment. It was a threat. The wind picks up, swirling leaves across the orchard path. Somewhere an owl calls, soft, low, a sound older than any prayer. You stand, brush the dust from your tunic, and walk back toward the manor. Past the herbs, past the well, past the girls with their candle and mirror. Because tonight you understand, in the medieval world, beauty could win you a husband, or a crown, or a stake. And sometimes you didn't get to choose which. By now the manor has grown quiet, eerily so. Even the fire in the great hearth seems to crackle more softly, its sparks trailing upward like whispers from centuries past. You wander into one of the guest chambers, ducking beneath a low archway and brushing your fingers along the heavy velvet curtain that separates this space from the corridor. Inside, the walls are hung with silk, and a carved wooden bed takes up half the room. But your eyes are drawn to the table in the corner, where a collection of objects sits like clues to a mystery. A comb made of bone, a pot of henna, a string of turquoise beads, and a small round mirror that isn't polished bronze, but, remarkably, glass. You've stumbled into a world beyond the Western Europe you've been tiptoeing through. Because beauty in the Middle Ages didn't follow a single rulebook. It was different in every culture. And tonight, you're peeking behind the veils of the global medieval world, from the tiled courts of Andalusia to the painted tents of the Mongol Empire. Let's start with a mainstream historical fact. The medieval world was more connected than we give it credit for. Trade routes, pilgrimages, wars, and diplomatic marriages carried not just spices and silk, but beauty standards across borders. What was considered attractive in one culture could influence another, or directly oppose it. Take Moorish Spain, for example. In Al-Andalus, where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian cultures intertwined, the beauty ideal was poetic elegance. Almond-shaped eyes outlined in kohl, glossy dark hair scented with jasmine, and skin cared for with rosewater and olive oil. Here, a pale face wasn't the goal, it was a symptom. True beauty glowed with health, warmth, and poetry. And the poetry? Oh, they meant it literally. Moorish love poems often praise the curve of a neck, the shadow under a lower lip, or the scent of henna'd hands. A lover might be called the flame who burned my sleep, or the gazelle-eyed queen of dusk. Dramatic? Yes. Effective? Always. A woman in this world would use crushed saffron to tint her cheeks, ambergris as perfume, and exfoliate with ground apricot pits or powdered coral. Kohl lined the eyes not just for allure, but for protection against the desert sun. A tradition as practical as it was beautiful. You glance again at the pot of henna. A quirky tidbit? In many Islamic regions, women dyed not just their hands, but the soles of their feet and even their fingernails. The red-orange stain was a sign of femininity and elegance. Some designs were simple, others so intricate they resembled lace. A bride with undecorated hands was considered unfinished. And over in Byzantium, beauty was luxury embodied. Gold leaf on the eyelids, pearl dust mixed into skin cream. Elaborate braided hairstyles tucked beneath veils of sheer silk. A noblewoman might wear up to 7 layers of fabric, each dyed with colors that screamed, "Yes, I absolutely own land." Here, beauty was less about modesty and more about mystique. The face might be hidden behind a translucent veil, but the effect was anything but subtle. Jewelry, embroidery, scent. It all told a story of power cloaked in holiness. Byzantine icons of saints and empresses looked nearly identical because the line between sacred and secular beauty blurred completely. Historians still argue how much intercultural borrowing actually happened. Did French noblewomen copy Moorish henna patterns? Did Venetian ladies try Kohl after visiting Eastern markets? The answer is probably. Trade was constant, and beauty, like gossip, travels fast. And then there were the Mongols. In the steppes of Central Asia, where yurts swayed in the wind, and the earth itself seemed to move, beauty had a completely different rhythm. Mongol women were admired for their strong builds, weather-hardened skin, and fierce eyes. A high forehead was good, yes, but so were strong cheekbones and wide hips. Life was mobile, rough, and beautiful in its resilience. A Mongol noblewoman might shave part of her hairline to accentuate her brow, wear her hair in elaborate horn-shaped buns, and apply mutton fat mixed with crushed plants to soften her skin in the brutal wind. Fragrance? Boiled herbs or resin burned inside the yurt, scenting everything, including the skin and hair. There's a fringe belief among some Mongol tribes that a woman's beauty could literally bless the land. A radiant bride meant fertile livestock, happy herds, and good weather. Entire marriage rituals were built around preparing the bride's appearance to reflect not just her desirability, but her spiritual alignment with the earth. They would say she carries spring in her face, which they would say. You step out of the guest chamber and down a tiled hallway, suddenly transported into a dream of silk and spices. Somewhere you hear music, plucked strings, perhaps a lute, and the smell of sandalwood follows you like a ghost. The door at the end of the hall is open. Inside, a traveler sits cross-legged on a cushion, his robe embroidered with birds and dragons. He greets you with a nod, and without speaking, hands you a small scroll. You unfurl it slowly, a poem, in Tongut script. And though you can't read it, you know what it says. It says beauty is a language. One spoken in spice and silk, in paint and pearl, in lashes and lace and laughter. It says in Japan, long black hair trailing behind a lady meant grace beyond words. In Ethiopia, shiny skin and delicate necklines were celebrated. In India, wide eyes and henna'd fingertips stirred hearts and lit festivals. And in every corner of the known world, beauty was a bridge. Across class, across belief, across the impossible span of distance. You roll the scroll back up and return it with a bow. The traveler smiles, pours you tea, and says softly, "We all look in mirrors, but we see what we've been taught to see." And you realize, no matter where you were born, The rules of beauty were made by the ones holding the pen. Some drew saints, some drew queens, some drew war horses with lipstick, but all of them drew us. Back in the manor's quiet study, you settle into a creaky wooden chair beside a flickering candle. The room is lined with books, real ones bound in leather and chained to the shelves like misbehaving monks. Dust floats in the still air. On a nearby desk, a half-finished painting rests beside a palette of dried pigments and delicate brushes. It's time we talk about art, or more specifically, how beauty standards were shaped, warped, and immortalized by the hands of medieval artists, poets, and scribes. Because let's be honest, some of this stuff didn't come from reality. It came from men with quills and brushes projecting their dream girls onto every saint, sinner, and shepherdess they could find. Your mainstream historical fact? Much of what we think we know about medieval beauty comes from artistic conventions, not direct observation. Painters, sculptors, manuscript illuminators, they weren't just recording what people looked like. They were idealizing, exaggerating, mythologizing. That's why all the angels have the same nose, and why every woman in a 14th century altarpiece has the expression of someone quietly judging your fashion choices. You rise from your seat and walk over to the painting. A noble woman seated under a tree. Her forehead, of course, is enormous. Her skin, pale as candle wax. Her lips, barely there. She gazes off into the distance, perhaps dreaming of a better eyebrow pencil. But you can tell this isn't a portrait. It's an ideal. Because back then, artists didn't paint you how you were. They painted you how society thought you should be. And that meant stylized features, symmetrical faces, and symbolic gestures. The long fingers weren't for realism. They were to show grace. The tilted head wasn't a crick in the neck. Now, it was modesty incarnate. A quirky tidbit? In some illuminated manuscripts, scribes would literally reuse the same face for every female figure. Mary, Eve, random maidens in the margins all looked identical. Why? Because that's what beauty looked like to the artist. Or more cynically, he just got really good at drawing one particular face and didn't feel like branching out. You flip through a nearby book, its pages covered in delicate Gothic script and tiny illustrations. Here's a shepherdess with cheeks like rose petals, even though she's been out tending sheep for 10 hours. Here's a queen with eyelashes so long they could sweep the floor. Here's a saint bleeding prettily, her expression serene. Art, even in its most brutal scenes, was committed to beauty. But it wasn't just visual artists. Poets were equally guilty. You remember a few lines from a courtly love poem you heard sung earlier in the hall. Her brow a moon, her voice a lyre, her steps as soft as friar's choir. Dramatic? Yes. Helpful? Number. No one knows what a friar's choir sounds like. Poetry. Created impossible standards, often for women the poet had never even spoken to. He saw her from across a courtyard, decided she was perfection, and then wrote 5 stanzas about the way her ankle caught the light. The medieval male gaze was feral. And the worst part? These exaggerated depictions bled into real expectations. A nobleman might compare his wife, whom he married at 14 and had spoken to 3 times, to a fictional woman in a romance epic. Why can't you be more like Lady Lunessa, who weeps only in iambic verse and smells like lilies even while dying? Historians still argue whether women internalize these depictions. Some evidence suggests they did. Mirrors were rare but not unknown, and women with access to manuscripts and religious art often tried to model themselves after saints, queens, or idealized lovers. Others suggest women were more pragmatic, aware that these standards were fantasy and surviving just fine, without a face shaped like a pear. You glance at another image on the wall, a religious painting of the Virgin Mary surrounded by angels. She looks young, radiant, but also exhausted. and maybe done with being the template for everyone's expectations. A woman enters the room, gently arranging scrolls on a shelf. She sees you studying the painting and says, "That one?" He painted her to look like his sister. You raise an eyebrow. "She didn't approve," she adds, "but flattery sells." Which brings us to the patrons. Much of medieval art was commissioned by churches, nobles, guilds, and they often dictated what beauty should look like. If a bishop wanted the Virgin to look more ethereal, she got a facelift. If a lord wanted his daughter's wedding portrait to imply fertility, she'd be painted with round cheeks and soft hands, regardless of her real appearance. Art didn't just reflect ideals, it created them. A fringe debate? Some scholars believe medieval artists subtly resisted these conventions, hiding real faces in the margins, painting humorous or grotesque figures into the corners of manuscripts as a way to push back against uniform beauty. The bored nun with one eyebrow, the peasant woman picking her nose, the bishop with a pig's face, tiny rebellions in gold leaf. And speaking of margins, you notice one now scrawled in red ink along the edge of a page. Beware the woman who knows she is beautiful. She will know other things too. Someone's scared. Because ultimately, the art of the age tells a conflicted story. Beauty was celebrated, yes, but only in specific forms, and often only when tamed, sanctified, or silenced. A beautiful woman who also had opinions? Dangerous? A beautiful woman who aged? Tragic. A beautiful woman who looked nothing like the saintly ideal. Ignored, or worse, altered. You sit again, candle flickering low. In the corner, a half-finished sculpture of a woman's face rests on the floor. Her features are plain, but her expression is alive. You wonder if the artist saw someone real and thought, this finally is the truth. Maybe she was a servant, maybe a merchant's wife, maybe a ghost, but for once it looks like someone saw her and didn't need to gild her into something she wasn't. The night has folded itself around the manor like a velvet cloak. Only the occasional hoot of an owl or a gust rattling a shutter reminds you that the world outside still exists. You're back in your chamber now, barefoot, robe drawn around your shoulders and belly full of roasted whatever that was. It's nearly time to rest, but before you drift off, there's one final part of this journey through medieval beauty we need to explore. One that didn't glitter with gilded gowns or glow under candlelight. Tonight you enter the final, often ignored chapter of the beauty narrative, aging, remedies, and legacy. Because even in a world obsessed with youth and glow, time still came for everyone. You sit near a small-looking glass, polished metal, warped and smoky, and peer at yourself in the dim light. If you were living here, in this era, the lines on your face wouldn't just be signs of time. They would be warning signs. The truth is, medieval society didn't have a lot of room for beauty past 35, or even 25 depending on your class. The mainstream historical fact? Aging women, especially among the nobility, faced a steep social decline, particularly if they were unmarried. A woman past childbearing age was often seen as having fulfilled her role, or having failed too. Either way, she was no longer at the center of the beauty story. She became the mother, the widow, the wise woman, which was sometimes code for ignored. And yet, the desire to preserve beauty never disappeared. In fact, medieval women developed surprisingly sophisticated anti-aging remedies. You pull out a small wooden box tucked beneath the bed and open it. Dried rose petals, beeswax, a vial of elderflower oil. Remedies like these were used to keep skin soft, reduce wrinkles, and maintain the bloom of youth. One popular concoction combined ground almonds, goat's milk, and honey to form a gentle exfoliant. Others rubbed a mix of parsley juice and egg yolk around the eyes to reduce puffiness. No Botox, no filler, just hope and herbs. A quirky tidbit? In some convents, nuns created rose water and vinegar tonics, not for vanity, but for divine reflection. a belief that keeping one's face clean and bright helped illuminate the soul during prayer. Skincare as theology. Glow for God. But here's the twist. While women were scrambling to slow time, older men were becoming more powerful. Silver hair on a nobleman meant wisdom, authority. On a woman, irrelevance. The double standard was medieval and timeless. Still, some women fought back. A duchess in Burgundy reportedly had a traveling apothecary create custom creams made with gold leaf and powdered freshwater pearls. Did they work? Doubtful. But she believed in it, and sometimes belief itself smooths the skin. Historians still argue about how many women actually use these remedies versus how many were written into text by male authors trying to paint women as vain. Were they really spending hours with snail slime and lily root? Or were they just trying to get through the day without being judged for looking tired? Aging men, meanwhile, leaned into their distinguished look. They dyed their beards with walnut ink if it turned too white, wore hats to hide baldness, and some even used lead combs filled with soot to darken their hair slowly over time. Yes, lead. Because again, beauty might kill you, but at least you looked good at your funeral. You step over to the hearth and sit near the low flames. A woman from the kitchens enters, her face lined but her eyes alert. She carries a mug of warm cider and hands it to you with a knowing smile. "Used to be the prettiest girl in the village," she says, no bitterness in her voice. "Now I make the best bread. Better legacy if you ask me." And that's the thing. Over time, many women redefined beauty on their own terms. Past the age of courtship and spectacle, they began to value things like intelligence, wisdom, humor, memory. They still braided their hair, still dabbed rose oil behind their ears, but not for anyone else. Just for themselves. You glance at a tapestry on the far wall. It shows a woman at 3 stages: a maiden with a flower crown, a mother holding a child, and a crone with a book. Her posture never changes, only her face and hair. She stands tall in all 3 scenes. That's not an accident. Even in a time when appearance ruled everything, some people understood that beauty didn't vanish. It transformed. One fringe belief from 15th century Wales? Wrinkles were God's lines, etched by holy winds to mark a life lived fully. The more lines, the more blessed. Try putting that on a skincare commercial. You return to the mirror. Your reflection's unclear. Maybe it always was. In this world, mirrors didn't tell the truth. They told a story. One warped by pigment, poetry, paranoia, and hope. And as the candle flickers low, you realize something. Beauty in the medieval world wasn't one thing. It was everything. A language, a trap, a crown, a curse, a game, a gift. And you walked through all of it, from powdered skin to perfumed armor, from stolen rings to silver hair, from flirtations to false accusations. You survived. So tonight, as you curl beneath heavy linen blankets, let your breath slow. Let your body soften. Let your face, painted by time and touch, rest. You don't need to glow to be beautiful. You're already luminous in the quiet. Exactly as you are. The fire in the hearth has settled to a low, amber glow. The manor no longer creaks. It exhales. Beyond the stone walls, the wind hums gently across the fields, carrying with it the scent of rosemary, old wood, and night. You lie in your bed, the linen sheets cool against your skin. The world you just wandered through, the powdered brows, the braided stories, the whispered judgments, has begun to fade like ink sinking into vellum. You've walked through 1,000 candles worth of time, and now you are still. Let your breath slow. Inhale. Feel the way your chest rises, steady and calm. Exhale. Let the day melt away. In the silence, you are more than a shape, more than a reflection. You are a memory waiting to be remembered, a presence wrapped in warmth and dusk. You don't need silk sleeves or sun-kissed shoulders. You don't need balm or blush or veils stitched with pearls. You only need rest. Because beauty at its quietest is peace, and tonight it is yours. Let the flicker of ancient stories fade from your mind. Let the candle gutter and go out. Let your body sink. Let your eyes close. You are enough, exactly as you are, exactly where you are, and everything else can wait until morning.